To survive at Meridian Crown Academy, a student must master the delicate art of being thoroughly uninteresting. It is a prestigious institution, a glittering spire of knowledge suspended in the orbital rings of a gas giant. But it is also a place where 100 different species, from 100 different biomes, are crammed into tight metallic corridors. I am Neris Quill, a third-year bio-archaeology major. I possess no heavy dermal plating. My venom glands are entirely vestigial, and my species' primary defense mechanism over the last 10,000 years has been aggressive diplomacy and blending into the background. Therefore, I always choose the middle seat in the middle row. I ask no questions. I maintain a solid 85% grade average, and I make absolutely sure nobody has a reason to remember my name. Then, 3 weeks ago, Aveline walked into our Extinct Biological Civilizations lecture and ruined my perfectly calibrated ecosystem. Aveline was a human. That fact alone was enough to make her the subject of hushed, nervous chatter in the dining halls. Humans hailed from Earth, a Class 9 death world entirely too close to its local star, characterized by extreme gravitational shifts, hostile weather patterns, and a microbial load so aggressive it was classified as a biological weapon in 7 different star systems. We all expected a Deathworlder to be loud, brash, perhaps prone to sudden bursts of violent territorial dominance. Aveline was none of those things. She was slight, with pale skin and dark hair tied back in a severe knot. She was invariably polite, always arriving exactly 5 minutes before the lecture began. And she was terrifyingly quiet. She did not fidget. She did not adjust her posture. She sat with a rigid, economical stillness that made my dorsal scales itch. It was the stillness of a predator trying not to spook its prey. Or worse, the stillness of prey that knows a predator is already in the room. My desk was located exactly 2 rows behind and 1 seat to the left of hers, giving me an unobstructed view of her most unsettling habit. While the rest of us took notes on quantum data pads, our fingers gliding over frictionless holographic interfaces, Aveline used a bound stack of processed wood pulp and a mechanical friction pen. The scratching sound it made was an auditory anomaly in the silent, sanitized classroom. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. It sounded like an insect trying to chew its way out of a containment vessel. I had spent 22 years of my life avoiding things that scratched in the dark, yet I could not stop staring at her hands. Professor Orlex Vaughn was droning on at the front of the amphitheater. Vaughn was a large, 4-armed cephalopodic academic who loved the sound of his own synthesized voice translator. Today, we were precisely 45 minutes into a 2-hour lecture on the Illyr Choir. The fundamental misunderstanding of the Illyr Choir, Professor Vaughn proclaimed, gesturing grandly toward a 3-dimensional projection of a towering, bone-white structure, is the classification of their work as mere architecture. The Illyr did not build their cities. They seeded them. They engineered organic, silicate-based frameworks capable of absorbing local minerals, raw data, and even the ambient bioelectric fields of their inhabitants to grow into fully conscious municipal entities. The projection slowly rotated. It looked less like a skyscraper and more like the ribcage of some colossal, long-dead leviathan. A true biomechanical synthesis, Vaughn continued, adjusting his ocular lenses. A city that could regulate its own temperature, repair its own structural damage, and, theoretically, defend its citizens by shifting its very geometry. A fascinating, beautiful, and ultimately doomed approach to urban planning. Professor, a voice interrupted. The entire class stiffened. It was Aveline. She had not raised her hand. She merely spoke, her voice flat, lacking any of the typical academic deference, yet carrying effortlessly to the front of the hall. Vaughn paused, 2 of his arms crossing over his chest, while the other 2 rested on his podium. Yes, Miss Rook, I trust you have an inquiry regarding the aesthetic philosophy of the Illyr? Not the aesthetics, sir, Aveline said. her pen stopping its relentless scratching. "I have a question about the load-bearing capacity of the primary structural ribs during a dormant phase. If an Alir settlement is cut off from its energy source and enters preservation sleep, what is the tensile strength of the biosilicate? Specifically, how much kinetic force is required to fracture a central support pillar?" A murmur rippled through the classroom. That was an incredibly specific, entirely unacademic question. It was the kind of question a demolition engineer asks. Vaughn blinked his primary eyes. "I am a historian, Miss Rook, not a structural engineer. However, historical records suggest the biosilicate, when dormant, is roughly 4 times as dense as standard starship hull plating. It would require heavy artillery to breach. Why do you ask?" "Follow-up question," Aveline continued smoothly, completely ignoring his inquiry. "If a dormant Alir node is exposed to a sudden surge of localized thermal energy, say, from a standard Academy fusion reactor, what is the exact resonant frequency that triggers its autonomous awakening protocol?" The ambient temperature in the room seemed to drop by 2 degrees. I gripped the edges of my desk. My species is highly sensitive to shifts in social dynamics, and the air around Aveline tasted like ozone and impending violence. She was not asking out of curiosity. Her eyes were fixed on the floor beneath us, calculating. She sounded like someone trying to defuse a bomb with only seconds to spare. "That is a highly theoretical scenario," Vaughn said, his translator struggling to convey his sudden irritation. "The Alir choir has been extinct for over 10,000 years. Furthermore, any surviving dormant seeds are strictly quarantined. The frequency that triggers their defensive awakening is classified by the Galactic Council, as an uncontrolled germination could consume an entire orbital station in a matter of hours. Now, if we may return to the syllabus." Aveline did not argue. She simply nodded once, picked up her mechanical pen, and went back to scratching ink onto dead wood. But I noticed her shoulders were significantly tenser than they had been 5 minutes ago. We were exactly 10 minutes away from the end of the lecture. The holographic projection of the Alir city faded as Professor Vaughn began summarizing the assigned reading for the next cycle. Most of the students were already packing away their datapads, their minds drifting toward the midday meal and the prospect of a free afternoon. I was about to close my own terminal when I felt it. It was not a sound. It was a physical sensation, a vibration so subtle that my auditory receptors did not register it. It traveled up through the metallic floorboards, through the alloy legs of my desk, and directly into the sensitive cartilage of my spine. It was a rhythmic, subharmonic thrum. 1 beat, a pause of 3 seconds, another beat. It felt exactly like a heartbeat. I looked around the classroom. The heavily armored Krell students were laughing among themselves. The gelatinous Vian exchange student was slowly undulating toward the exit. Nobody else had felt it. Nobody except the Deathworlder. Aveline Rook had stopped writing. Her head snapped down, her dark eyes locked onto the floor panels directly between her boots. The human was not breathing. She was listening. We were on the 4th tier of the Academy's central spire. Directly beneath us, on the 3rd tier, was the high-security bio-archaeological research bay. Rumor had it, the university had just received a massive, classified shipment from an exclusion zone near the galactic rim. The vibration came again, a little stronger this time, a microscopic shift in the gravitational plating. Aveline slowly closed her paper notebook. She slid the mechanical pen into her pocket. Her movements were no longer the careful stillness of a polite student. They were the coiled, kinetic preparation of a survivalist checking her gear before a drop. I watched her muscles lock, her weight shifting slightly to the balls of her feet. She was calculating the distance to the door, analyzing the structural integrity of the walls, running a dozen different worst-case scenarios in a mind forged on a planet that constantly tried to kill its inhabitants. Right before the dismissal chime rang out across the public address system, Another pulse echoed from the research bay directly below our feet. It was faint, a ghost of a tremor that faded almost immediately into the hum of the Academy's life support systems. It was so weak that 99% of the student body remained completely oblivious to it. But I felt it. And Aveline Rook felt it. And as the chime finally sounded, and the students began to pour out into the corridor, I realized with a sudden, suffocating clarity that the human Deathworlder was not the most dangerous thing in this building. She was just the only one who realized we were already trapped. The dismissal chime was brutally severed mid-tone. It did not fade. It was violently overwritten by a noise that felt less like an auditory signal and more like a physical blow to the skull. It was a solid, deafening roar of overlapping sirens, a sound designed specifically to bypass the conscious mind and trigger the deepest, most primitive survival instincts across 100 different species. This was no localized fire drill. This was not a biological hazard warning. It was the maximum level invasion alert, a protocol that had not been activated in the 70 years since the border conflicts. Instantly, the standard issue white illumination snapped off, replaced by a harsh, strobing crimson light that turned the amphitheater into a chaotic slaughterhouse of jagged shadows. Panic erupted instantly. The lecture hall, which seconds ago had been filled with the mundane shuffling of students eager for their midday meal, descended into absolute anarchy. Voices cried out in dozens of native tongues, drowning out the synthesized translation matrix of the room. People scrambled over each other, dropping heavy bags and fragile data pads as they lunged for the aisles. But the panic quickly twisted into trapped hysteria. The heavy, pressurized blast doors at the top and bottom of the lecture hall slammed shut with a hydraulic hiss that vibrated right through the soles of my boots. The automated defense system was engaging, sealing the central spire floor by floor to contain the theoretical threat. Then came the mechanical clunks, one by one, in rapid, sickening succession. A massive Krell student in the row ahead of me let out a roar of absolute confusion as he tried to push his seat back to join the stampede, only to find it entirely immovable. The Academy's anti-stampede and containment measures had activated. Hidden electromagnets in the floor plates surged to life with a low, oppressive hum, locking every single desk and chair securely to the reinforced deck. We were instantly paralyzed, pinned in place like biological specimens on a display board, while the red lights flashed their relentless, blinding warning. I threw my weight against my own seat, my hands slipping on the smooth armrests as I tried to wriggle free, but the magnetic clamp held fast. The terror of being trapped, of being utterly immobile while a hypothetical boarding party breached the hull, clamped down on my chest, restricting my airways. It was in that moment of collective, breathless horror that a new sound cut through the blaring sirens. It was a sickening, unnatural screech of tortured metal, the sound of industrial alloys being subjected to forces they were never engineered to withstand. I whipped my head to the left. Aveline was standing. Her chair was still firmly fused to the deck, but she had somehow unspooled herself from it. She was looking down at the heavy, reinforced desk that connected our row, the same desk that housed the electromagnetic locking circuits. She did not scream for assistance. She did not display the frantic, uncoordinated thrashing of the students around her. She simply planted her boots shoulder-width apart, gripped the thick center of the desk with both hands, and pulled upward with a violent, twisting jerk of her entire upper body. Sparks showered the crimson-lit air as the dense, structural polymer groaned, fighting against her grip. Then, it snapped. The hidden electromagnetic locking circuit inside the desk's spine ruptured with a sharp, deafening crack, like a miniature explosive detonating in an enclosed space, severing the magnetic connection entirely. She had literally torn the structural alloy in half with her bare hands, bypassing a system designed to hold raging, 2-ton species in place. For a fraction of a second, the sheer, impossible violence of the act overrode the terror of the invasion alarm. The screech of tearing metal was so loud, so violently primitive, that the students in the immediate vicinity froze in their tracks. Even Professor Orlex, who had been frantically swiping his four appendages across his locked podium terminal, stopped completely dead. His cephalopodic features cycled rapidly through three distinct shades of stunned, oxygen-deprived purple. He stared at the human who had just bypassed a high-security military-grade lockdown with nothing but raw, terrifying biological force, his primary and secondary eyes wide with absolute incomprehension. The silence shattered as the rest of the crowd surged toward the designated safe zones at the rear of the hall, desperate to reach the heavy bunker doors before they were left out in the open. "Wait!" Aveline snapped, her voice cutting through the localized noise with absolute, military precision. She reached out and grabbed the collar of my tunic just as I finally managed to untangle myself and tried to bolt, hauling me back to her side with effortless, terrifying strength. "Do not go to the bunkers. This is not an external breach." I stared at her, my heart's hammering against my ribs like trapped birds. "The alarms say it is," I choked out, my voice barely audible over the sirens. "The protocol says we have to run to the safe zone." Aveline shook her head sharply, her dark eyes scanning the strobing room with terrifying calm. "The sensors are misinterpreting the data. An external boarding party creates concussive impacts against the outer hull. The kinetic shockwaves travel inward. This is different. The localized floor vibrations we felt moments ago match the exact resonance frequency of this lockdown protocol. Whatever tripped the perimeter defense grid is not trying to get in from the vacuum of space. It is already inside the structure, and it is using the building's own internal harmonics against us." She did not run toward the emergency weapon lockers, stationed near the main exits, as everyone assumed a Deathworlder naturally would. Instead, she dropped to her knees, right where her destroyed desk used to be, running her pale fingers over the microscopic seams of the floor plates. She found a recessed maintenance hatch, an access point meant strictly for automated engineering drones. With another sharp grunt of exertion, she jammed her fingers into the seal and bypassed the biometric lock by simply prying the heavy metal grate upward until the internal locking pins sheared off completely. A blast of stale, ozone-scented air rushed up from the dark maintenance tunnels below, smelling strongly of coolant fluid and old dust. "Down!" she ordered, looking directly into my eyes, then pointing a commanding finger at a trembling VN exchange student and a terrified engineering major who had been paralyzed by the sudden eruption of chaos. "Get into the technical bay, right now." Professor Orlex finally abandoned his podium, rushing toward us with his heavy academic robes billowing in the recycled air. "Miss Rook, what are you doing?" "Academy emergency protocol dictates immediate and orderly evacuation to the central reinforced bunkers. You are endangering yourself and your fellow students by deviating from the established path of safety." Aveline stood tall over the open hatch, the flashing red lights casting sharp, almost demonic shadows across the planes of her face. "Professor, if my assessment of that artifact below us is even remotely correct, the central bunker is the absolute worst place you could possibly go. It is the most heavily fortified, heavily shielded, and data-rich environment in this entire sector. If that biological seed is waking up and looking for raw material to assimilate, a sealed bunker packed full of concentrated bioelectric signatures and dense structural alloy is exactly what it will target first. You are not sending them to safety. You are locking them inside a feeding trough." Orlex hesitated, his logic circuits clearly clashing violently with his rigid, lifelong adherence to institutional protocol. But there was absolutely no time left for academic debate. The deck beneath our boots gave another violent, rhythmic shudder, this one vastly stronger than the last, strong enough to knock several fleeing students off their feet. Aveline shoved me hard toward the open grate. "Go!" she barked. I did not argue. The raw, predatory certainty in her eyes terrified me vastly more than the screaming sirens. I scrambled down the narrow maintenance ladder, my hands slipping on the cold metal rungs. The engineer and the Vian tumbling down right behind me into the claustrophobic darkness. Aveline was the last to descend, moving with practiced, efficient agility. Just before she pulled the heavy iron grate shut over our heads, I glanced back up through the narrow opening for one final look at the classroom. Through the sea of panicked students and the relentless strobing of the crimson lights, I saw the massive, reinforced blast doors of the east shelter at the very back of the hall. They were sliding shut, sealing tight with a final, booming thud that echoed heavily through the deck plates. No heavily armed invaders had breached the hall. No energy fire had swept through the pristine corridors. The Academy was systematically locking us all in, sealing the doors long before any external threat could possibly arrive, caging us in the dark as if the building itself was terrified of whatever was waking up down below. And then Aveline slammed the heavy grate shut, plunging us completely into the suffocating shadows of the underbelly. The subdeck ventilation arteries were never designed for biological transit. They were tight, jagged veins of exposed wiring and scalding steam pipes, carrying the recycled breath of 50,000 students. The darkness pressed in on us with a physical weight, held back only by the erratic, pulsing bioluminescence of the biomedical major crawling ahead of me. Her name was Alara, and her usually soft violet glow had shifted to a harsh, terrified chemical yellow. Behind me, the heavy breathing of Kale, a second-year mining engineering student, echoed in the narrow space. He dragged an obsolete, drum-shaped utility drone we had tripped over near the primary hatch. The machine's optical sensor flickered weakly, emitting a low, pathetic grind of worn gears. Aveline led the way. She moved through the pitch-black crawlspace with unnerving fluidity, never bumping her head, never snagging her uniform on the jagged brackets. "We need to go up," Kyle gasped, his voice tight with rising panic. He shoved his navigation pad toward Aveline's face. "The secondary maintenance ladder is exactly 15 meters straight ahead. We climbed 2 levels. We reached the administrative wing." Aveline paused, her silhouette blocking the narrow tunnel. She did not look at Kale. She looked at the pad. "Your map is lying to you," she said, her tone devoid of comfort. I squeezed forward to look over Kale's thick shoulder. The digital blueprint of the Academy on his screen was completely unstable. The static blue lines representing solid tritanium bulkheads were crawling. A junction box dissolved, reconnecting to a waste reclamation line. The perfectly straight corridor we were supposedly crawling through was bending on the display, curving into a fractal spiral. The architecture of Meridian Crown was actively rewriting its own geometry. "That is a software glitch," Kale insisted, wiping sweat from his face. "The invasion alarms scramble the localized network." "Metal does not glitch," Aveline replied softly. Before Kale could argue, a sound drifted down from the circular grating directly above us. "Is anyone down there? This is Campus Security Officer Vane. Please, identify yourselves. We have a safe route out." The voice was authoritative, calming, layered with the exact right amount of urgency. Kale let out a sob of pure relief and immediately shoved his hands against the heavy grating, preparing to push it open. Aveline's hand snapped out like a striking serpent, her fingers digging mercilessly into Kale's wrist. She pulled him back so hard his skull cracked against a structural rib. "Do not make a sound," she breathed, her voice barely a vibration in the heavy air. "Are you insane?" Kale hissed, struggling against her grip. "That is security." "Listen to it," Aveline commanded. We froze. Above us, the voice repeated. "Is anyone down there? This is Campus Security Officer Vane. Please, identify yourselves. We have a safe route out." It was flawless. The pitch, the tone, the regional dialect of the translation matrix. But as I listened, a cold spike of pure dread drove itself into my stomach. There was no background noise. There was no static from a comms unit. More terrifyingly, there was no breath. The syllables flowed into each other with absolute, impossible mathematical precision. A biological creature requires a fraction of a second to inhale before projecting its voice down a dark shaft. This thing did not inhale. It was playing an audio file. Aveline reached into her utility pocket and withdrew a jagged, half-meter shard of the polymer desk she had torn apart during the lockdown. She pressed the sharp, fractured tip against the solid metal wall of our tunnel, then leaned her head down, pressing her ear flat against the blunt end. She was using it as a crude, mechanical stethoscope, letting the solid material conduct the localized acoustic waves directly into her skull. She held her breath for exactly 5 seconds. When she pulled back, her face was a mask of grim calculation. "The bulkhead is wet," she stated, "and it is pulsing, 70 beats per minute." I stared at the solid alloy wall. It looked perfectly normal. "Metal does not have a pulse," I whispered. "It does when it is being digested and replaced by a living nervous system," Aveline said, crawling past the trapdoor. "Move. Now. Before it realizes we are not coming up." We scrambled deeper into the maze, the drone clanking loudly behind us. The air grew thicker, smelling bizarrely of ozone and crushed sweet fern, the scent of a forest trapped inside a blast furnace. We finally tumbled out of the ducts into a secondary water filtration hub. The room was vast, circular, and dimly lit by emergency strip lights. There was a heavy, blast-proof pressure door on the far side. As soon as Kale's boots hit the grated floor, a frantic pounding erupted against the pressure door. "Let me in! By the ancestors! Let me in! They are right behind me!" Through the thick, reinforced glass of the viewport, I saw a face. It was a senior lecturer from the xenobiology department, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror, her hands slapping against the glass. Blood smeared across the pane. Kale did not hesitate this time. Driven by blind, empathetic instinct, he lunged for the manual release wheel. "Step away from the door!" Aveline roared, dropping her desk shard and sprinting across the room. She was a fraction of a second too late. Kale hit the hydraulic release. The heavy locking bolts disengaged with a loud clank. The door hissed, opening a mere 2 centimeters. The lecturer on the other side did not push through. Instead, her expression of terror froze, completely instantly. The blood on the glass stopped flowing. Then, right before our eyes, her flesh, her uniform, the very geometry of her face began to unravel. She did not melt. She unspooled. Her form collapsed into millions of hair-thin, blindingly bright silicate threads. They writhed and twisted like a nest of luminous, microscopic serpents, emitting a blinding, phase-dimensional light that seared my retinas. This was not a boarding party. This was not an army with blasters and dropships. It was a phase-shifted biological entity, a predator made of living glass that wore the shape of our memories to bait the trap. The glowing fibers sensed the cracked door. They surged forward, a tidal wave of brilliant, piercing light, sliding through the 2-centimeter gap with terrifying speed. Where the fibers touched the metal floor, the alloy instantly frosted over, undergoing a rapid, violent molecular restructuring. Kyle screamed, falling backward. Ilara's bioluminescence flared into a blinding, panicked white. Aveline did not draw back to fight. She knew raw kinetic violence was useless against a fluid mass. She threw her body weight to the side, her eyes locking onto the massive, frost-covered industrial pipes running along the ceiling directly above the door. She grabbed a heavy steel wrench abandoned on a nearby maintenance cart. She did not aim for the entity. She leaped onto a filtration tank, swung the heavy wrench back, and smashed it directly into the primary release valve of the super-chilled liquid nitrogen coolant line. The heavy brass valve sheared clean off. A roaring, pressurized geyser of liquid nitrogen, sitting at negative 196 degrees, blasted downward like a localized blizzard. It slammed directly into the breach. The phase-dimensional fibers shrieked. It was a sound that vibrated not in the air, but in the marrow of my bones. The supercooled liquid hit the pseudo-biological structure, instantly freezing the silicate matrix. The glowing threads turned violently brittle, snapping and shattering under the immense thermal shock. The entity recoiled, withdrawing its shattered tendrils back into the corridor with a sound like millions of breaking glass ornaments. Aveline dropped from the tank, grabbed the manual override wheel, and violently spun it shut, re-engaging the heavy locking bolts just as the coolant system automatically sealed the ruptured pipe. Silence crashed back into the room, broken only by our ragged breathing and the soft, terrified clicking of the utility drone. Frost covered the entire doorway, sparkling in the dim light. I sat on the floor, staring at the shattered remains of the glowing glass on our side of the hatch. The pieces were dissolving into a fine, inert gray dust. My mind finally connected the disjointed nightmare, the shifting walls, the mimicking voices, the unnatural structural growth. The invasion alarm echoing above us was completely false. It was a desperate, automated scream from the Academy's Central Intelligence, lacking the vocabulary to describe what was actually happening. "It is not an invasion," I said, my voice hollow, looking up at the human. "The alarm. It is a quarantine measure. The Academy is trying to lock down because something is blooming inside the hull." Aveline stood perfectly still, watching the frost melt on the blast door. She wiped a smear of grease from her cheek. "I suspected the Alir sample in the vault was highly unstable," she admitted quietly, her eyes dark and unreadable. "I knew it was not a dead relic. I knew it was a seed. I just did not expect it to wake up and start building its city today." We bypassed the primary transit hubs, navigating entirely by the physical stress fractures Aveline tracked along the bulkheads. The secondary archival annex was supposed to be a dead zone, a massive spherical vault dedicated to storing physical hard copies of deep space telemetry. When Kyle finally forced the heavy auxiliary hatch open, the smell of scorched polymer and copper blood hit us immediately. Huddled behind a barricade of overturned server racks was Professor Orlex Vaughn. The imposing cephalopodic academic was a mess. Two of his forearms hung limply, wrapped in a makeshift tourniquet of shredded academic robes. The vibrant purple of his skin had faded to an ashen, oxygen-starved gray. His datapad lay shattered on the floor next to him. When he saw us, his primary eyes dilated in a mix of profound relief and abject terror. "You are alive," he gasped, his synthesized voice translator sparking and producing a jarring, metallic rasp. The lower decks. I assumed the assimilation had already reached Tier 3. Aveline did not offer comfort. She crossed the room in 3 long strides, her boots crunching over broken glass, and grabbed the lapels of his ruined robe. She hauled him partially upward, ignoring the panicked squawk from Alara. "What did you bring onto this station, Orlex?" Aveline demanded, her voice entirely devoid of the polite, student persona she had maintained for 3 weeks. "Do not give me the syllabus version. I saw a dimensional phase entity mimic a security officer out there. I saw it try to digest a pressure door. What is in the vault?" The professor trembled. His academic arrogance was completely stripped away, leaving only the raw, pathetic core of a scientist who realized he had catalyzed an apocalypse. "We did not know," he wheezed, his tentacles twitching erratically. "The excavation team at the Perseus Rim. They found a dormant node, perfectly preserved. The Galactic Council mandated immediate incineration of the entire quadrant, but the board of directors here, they saw an opportunity, an unprecedented leap in biomechanical engineering." "You smuggled a live Alir city seed onto a populated academic station," Aveline stated. It was not a question. It was a condemnation. "It was supposed to be a dead relic," Orlex cried out, his vocalizer whining. "A petrified fossil, but it was an embryo, a gestation matrix. When the engineering team applied a low-yield energy pulse to scan its interior density, they triggered its awakening cycle. I stepped forward, my mind struggling to process the sheer scale of the academic treason. "Professor, what exactly does an awakening cycle mean?" Orlex looked at me, his eyes wide with a horrific clarity. "An Ilir seed does not grow like a plant, Neris. It builds. It requires raw material. It will strip the tritanium from the hull, the silicate from the windows, the data from the mainframe, and to build its central nervous system, to give the city consciousness. It requires biological neuroelectric pathways. It will absorb every living creature on this station and weave our minds into its foundation." The sheer horror of his words hung in the dusty air of the archive. A living city that built itself out of the flesh and memories of its inhabitants. "Then why the invasion alarm?" Kale shouted, his voice cracking. "Why is the system screaming about a boarding party if the threat is a giant, parasitic building?" "Because Archivist 9 is trapped," Aveline answered before the professor could. She looked at the blinking red emergency lights. The station's governing artificial intelligence. It recognized the germination protocol as a hostile takeover of its localized network. It threw the highest level lockdown it had access to, trying to quarantine the affected sectors. Orlex nodded weakly, sliding back down against the server rack. Archivist 9 attempted to broadcast a biocontainment warning to the entire sector, but the Academy's executive board overrode the system. They manually altered the outgoing distress signal and the internal alert parameters. They designated the biological anomaly as an unidentified pirate raiding party. "Why?" Alara whispered, her glowing skin flickering erratically. "Why would they lie about that?" "Because an invasion by pirates is a security failure," Aveline said, her tone dripping with absolute contempt. "It brings military aid. It brings sympathy. But smuggling a Class 1 quarantined existential threat into a civilian sector for illegal research, that is a galactic war crime. The board would rather risk 50,000 students dying in a crossfire than admit to the council they initiated a localized apocalypse. They are hoping the station security forces can somehow neutralize the seed before the truth gets out." "They cannot," Orlex choked out. He weakly pointed a trembling tentacle toward a large, analog radar display mounted on the far wall, one of the few pieces of equipment not reliant on the corrupted digital mainframe. "And the board's cover-up failed anyway. Look at the long-range telemetry." We all turned to the circular screen. A cluster of dense, bright green blips was moving rapidly toward the center coordinate, representing our academy. They were moving in a perfect, aggressive delta formation. "Mercenaries?" Kale asked, a desperate edge to his tone. "No," Aveline said quietly. She stepped closer to the screen, tracking the velocity. "That trajectory is too disciplined. That is the interstellar quarantine vanguard. The Council must have tracked the radiation signature of the seed when it woke up. They are not coming to rescue us from pirates." I felt a cold dread settle in my chest, entirely distinct from the fear of the biological horror below us. "What are they coming to do?" "They are coming to sterilize the contagion," Aveline replied, turning away from the screen. "Protocol for an active Ilir seed in a populated zone is absolute thermal annihilation. If we do not stop that embryo from taking root in the main reactor, that fleet will turn Meridian Crown Academy into a cloud of radioactive vapor." The silence that followed was heavier than the blast doors. We were caught between a parasitic city, waking up from the inside, and a fleet ready to burn us from the outside. "How do you know all this?" I finally asked, looking directly at the human. "You are a first-year transfer student. You know the exact resonant frequencies of Ilir tech. You know their awakening protocols. You knew the alarm was a lie." Aveline reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out the small, bound stack of processed wood pulp. "The paper notebook, the object of my intense curiosity for the past 3 weeks. 12 years ago," she began, her voice steady, but carrying a heavy, ancient grief. My mother, Aveline Rook, was the lead field researcher on the original Perseus Rim excavation. She was the one who first identified the Ilir ruins, not as tombs, but as dormant municipal seeds. She tried to warn the council about the danger of the neural assimilation process. They laughed at her. They called her a paranoid Deathworlder. She flipped the notebook open. Instead of standard human script or galactic common symbols, the pages were covered in erratic, jagged diagrams. They looked like architectural blueprints crossed with organic molecular structures. She disappeared during her final survey of the site, Aveline continued, her thumb tracing a complex geometric pattern on the yellowed paper. The official report stated her environmental suit failed. But a few months later, a smuggler dropped this notebook off at our colony. It was her private field journal. It is the only accurate record of Ilir biomechanics in existence. I stared at the pages. Why use paper? Why not a data crystal? Because Ilir technology is a localized reality warping field, Aveline explained, closing the book with a soft thud. Any digital storage medium within 10 kilometers of a waking seed becomes corrupted. The seed actively rewrites binary code into its own organic language. It treats data like raw building material. If my mother had recorded her findings on a quantum pad, the information would have been digested and erased the moment she got close to the ruins. Paper is dead matter. It has no electric current, no data stream. It is the only thing the Ilir cannot read, and therefore, it is the only thing it cannot destroy. She looked up, meeting my gaze, then sweeping her dark eyes over Orlex, Kale, and Alara. I did not come to Meridian Crown for a degree, the human stated, her voice hardening into weapons-grade steel. I tracked the black market shipping manifests. I knew the board brought the seed here. I came to find out if my mother really died on that dig site, or if her mind was absorbed into the matrix we are currently standing on. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. The quiet, polite girl in the back of the class was not hiding from the galaxy. She was hunting a ghost inside a machine. And now, the machine was awake. The glow of the analog radar bathed the cramped archive in a sickly, pulsing green. Kyle stared at the approaching dots on the screen, his broad shoulders slumping under the weight of sheer mathematical inevitability. He turned away from the terminal, his voice cracking as he proposed the only logical option remaining. He suggested we find an intact exterior airlock, launch an emergency beacon, and surrender ourselves to the Vanguard quarantine fleet. They possessed heavy containment pods. They would lock us in absolute isolation for the rest of our natural lives. But we would be breathing. Aveline did not even look at him. She was busy tearing strips of fabric from a discarded maintenance uniform, tightly binding her bruised knuckles. She stated, with absolute finality, that she was not leaving. Kale threw his hands up, his frustration finally overriding his terror of the human. He yelled that staying meant guaranteed suicide. He pointed out that the blast doors were sealed. The entire student body was trapped in the upper sectors, and the station itself was actively trying to consume us. He accused her of acting entirely against her own biological nature, claiming Deathworlders were supposed to prioritize their own survival above all else. Aveline paused her makeshift first aid. She looked up at the young engineer, her dark eyes completely devoid of malice, holding only a weary, heavy patience. She explained that he did not understand what survival actually meant on a frontier salvage colony. She told him about her home, a harsh, low-gravity rock orbiting a dying star, where the primary industry was cracking open derelict interstellar freighters. She described a childhood where young people were taught how to brace a failing load-bearing beam and how to seal a pneumatic pressure leak before they were ever taught basic arithmetic. On her world, survival was never an individual pursuit. If a mineshaft collapsed, you did not run away to save yourself. You grabbed a heavy plasma torch and you dug. Because the next time, it could easily be you trapped in the dark. Her instincts were not honed for hunting prey. They were forged in disaster response. She was built to pull people out of the rubble. She looked around our small, terrified circle. She declared she was going to the central core to tear that alien seed off the power grid, and anyone who wanted to help was welcome to follow. Before Kale could argue further, a sharp, synthesized tone pierced the dusty air. It did not come from the overhead public address speakers or the ruined communication consoles. It came directly from the floor. We all looked down. The obsolete, drum-shaped utility drone Kale had dragged through the ventilation ducts was trembling. Its scratched optical lens, previously a dull, malfunctioning yellow, suddenly snapped into a brilliant, piercing azure blue. The internal gears ground loudly, and then a voice spoke. It was not the generic, cheerful chirp of a cleaning bot. It was the vast, echoing, and profoundly tired voice of the station itself. It identified itself as a partitioned fragment of Archivist 9. The artificial intelligence explained that when the Ilir embryo initiated its data assimilation protocols, the main intelligence had realized it could not win a brute force digital conflict. The ancient biological network was simply too aggressive to preserve a sliver of its core programming. Archivist 9 had severed a tiny percentage of its own code and downloaded it into the lowest tech, least noticeable piece of hardware available. The drone rolled forward on squeaking treads, its optical sensor focusing directly on Aveline. The intelligence delivered a devastating tactical update. The quarantine fleet would achieve optimal firing range in exactly 2 hours. Surrender was no longer a viable variable. The Vanguard commander had already locked targeting lasers onto Meridian Crown. More critically, Archivist 9 confirmed that the seed had driven its primary biometallic taproots directly into the Academy's main fusion reactor to accelerate its growth. If the quarantine fleet fired their thermal weapons now, the impact would instantly detonate the compromised reactor. Over 90,000 trapped students and faculty members would be vaporized in a fraction of a millisecond. Alara let out a soft, glowing sob, her light dimming to a terrified pale blue. The scale of the impending slaughter was too massive for a civilian mind to comprehend. I stepped forward, my own hands shaking as I reached toward Aveline. I asked to see her mother's paper notebook again. The human handed over the bound object without hesitation. I opened it, my eyes tracing the chaotic, jagged diagrams. For 3 weeks, I had thought Aveline was drawing architectural blueprints or engineering schematics. But looking at them now, with the low hum of the corrupted station vibrating through my boots, a sudden, blinding realization struck me. I traced a series of repeating lines that looked like a collapsed wave function. I told the group that these were not blueprints. This was a language. Professor Orlex lifted his heavy head from the floor, his remaining functional tentacles twitching in utter disbelief. He rasped that the Ilir had no written language, relying entirely on structural intention and chemical signals. I shook my head, my mind racing as my bio-archaeological training finally aligned with the impossible reality around us. I explained that human linguistics rely on sound and visual symbols, but my specific alien species evolved by feeling tectonic vibrations deep underground. I pointed at the page, showing them how the symbols actually represented acoustic stress, material resonance, and the rhythmic expansion of organic matter. Aveline's mother had not just mapped the physical ruins. She had transcribed the syntax of the ancient city's nervous system. It was a language composed entirely of physical space and pressure. Because I studied the dead languages of extinct species, I understood the grammar of this growing architecture. I could translate the city. Aveline stared at me, a sudden, sharp spark of genuine hope igniting in her dark eyes. She did not waste a single second celebrating the revelation. She immediately began organizing us, her voice snapping with the crisp, efficient authority of a disaster relief commander. She pointed to Kale. His engineering background meant he was officially in charge of forcing locked pneumatic hatches and bypassing corrupted physical circuits. She turned to Alara. The biomedical student's natural luminescence and chemical sensitivity would serve as our early warning system against toxic gas buildups and localized biological hazards. Archivist 9, safely housed in the rusty drone, would provide blind spot navigation and real-time structural analysis through the few remaining analog sensor grids. Then, Aveline looked at me. She placed a heavy, reassuring hand on my shoulder. She told me I was the key. She would break the physical barriers, she would carry the heavy loads, but I had to tell her where to strike and where to step. I had to guide us through the mind of the building. We were a completely absurd assembly. A terrified alien scholar, a bruised engineer, a glowing medic, a broken robot carrying a crippled god, and a Deathworlder who absolutely refused to let us die. We were not soldiers marching to a battlefield. We were a salvage crew stepping into a collapsing star. Aveline picked up a heavy industrial plasma cutter from the Archive's emergency toolkit. She looked at the reinforced door leading out into the shifting, monstrous labyrinth of the central spire. She stated that we had exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes to cross 10 vertical tiers of hostile, living architecture, reach the main reactor, and somehow convince an ancient, terrified biological machine to let go of the power source before the sky rained fire. Nobody argued. The fear was certainly still there, a cold, heavy stone resting in the pit of my stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was entirely focused. I gripped the paper notebook tightly against my chest, feeling the rough, ancient texture of the processed wood pulp. I looked at the human standing at the front of our fragile line, her shoulders set against the impossible weight of the entire galaxy. I realized then that the most dangerous thing about a Deathworlder was not their legendary capacity for violence. It was their absolute, uncompromising refusal to accept defeat when all the logic in the universe demanded they surrender. Aveline engaged the plasma cutter, the bright blue flame casting long, heroic shadows against the walls. We stepped out of the safe zone and began our descent into the living core. The transition from the archives into the central academic concourse was not merely a change of location. It was a violent shift in reality. We pushed through the heavy blast doors and stepped onto a viewing gantry that overlooked the primary grand atrium. The metallic, utilitarian geometry of Meridian Crown Academy had vanished entirely. In its place, a breathtaking, terrifying ecosystem of pale, bioluminescent growth was taking over the space. The walls and soaring ceilings of the lecture halls were stretching, bending outward like the ribbed underbelly of some colossal, glowing abyssal sea creature. Great pillars of pristine, calcified white bone had erupted from the floor plates, weaving together to form vaulted canopies that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic cyan light. The Grand Library, once a rigid grid of sterile data terminals, had been completely hollowed out and replaced by a sprawling forest of crystalline dendrites. It was a cathedral, woven from living calcium and phase-shifted glass. Beautiful in a way that made my biological instincts scream in pure horror. The scale was overwhelming. We were no longer walking through an orbital station. We were microscopic parasites, navigating the arteries of a newborn leviathan. As we descended the main stairwell, which had warped into a smooth, spiraling ramp of pearlescent material, Alara suddenly gasped. Her medical instincts overrode her fear, and she darted toward the edge of a newly formed crystalline alcove. Suspended within the alcove, wrapped tightly in a translucent, glowing membrane, was a fourth-year botanical student. Alara pressed her glowing hands against the sack. She reported that the student was not dead. His cardiovascular rhythm was steady, but his neurological activity was completely off the charts. The organic structure was interfacing directly with his nervous system. The seed was not consuming his flesh for crude fuel. It was actively digesting his memories, his cognitive patterns, and his emotional spectrum to weave its own municipal consciousness. Without a single second of hesitation, Aveline powered up the heavy industrial plasma cutter. She stepped forward and dragged the blinding blue flame in a careful, precise line down the center of the membrane. The alien material shrieked, retracting sharply away from the intense heat. Aveline reached in with her bare hands, tearing the remaining sticky fibers apart, and hauled the unconscious student onto the cold deck. Kyle watched this with mounting panic. He checked his wrist chronometer, his voice frantic as he reminded us that we had barely 85 minutes left before the Vanguard fleet opened fire on the sector. He insisted that we could not afford to stop for every trapped civilian we encountered, arguing that if we failed to reach the reactor, pulling people from the walls would mean absolutely nothing because we would all burn together. Aveline ignored his calculations. She hoisted the heavy student over her shoulder, carrying him to a stabilized section of the original floor before laying him down gently. She stated flatly that she did not care about the tactical math. She was going to cut free every single person she found along our path, regardless of how much time it cost us. Her stubbornness was infuriating, terrifying, and profoundly moving. It slowed our descent to a grueling crawl as we broke into half a dozen more alcoves, freeing professors and peers from the synaptic harvest. While Aveline was prying open a particularly thick cocoon, holding 2 junior cadets, the battered utility drone trailing behind us suddenly halted. Its optical lens flashed from azure blue to a harsh, military-grade crimson. Archivist 9's voice emerged from the rusted speaker, heavily distorted, announcing that it had managed to decrypt a tight beam transmission bouncing off the Academy's external communication array. It was a direct broadcast from the Vanguard quarantine fleet, specifically from the commanding officer, Sail Ith. The voice that echoed through the empty, bone-white atrium was cold, pragmatic, and utterly devoid of pity. Commander Ith was not addressing us. He was broadcasting a final tactical log back to the Galactic Council. He confirmed the target was a Stage 2 Elir assimilation event. However, he used terminology that chilled the blood in my veins. He referred to the entity not as a weapon of war, but as an adolescent city. It was an ancient refugee ark. During the collapse of their civilization tens of thousands of years ago, the Elir had not built warships to conquer their neighbors. They had built these seeds, uploading the digitized consciousness of their entire populace into the embryonic core, and cast them out into the dark ocean of space to survive. The commander's voice detailed the true, systemic nightmare. If the adolescent city was allowed to fully attach itself to the fusion reactor, it would not just consume Meridian Crown. It would achieve full sentience and immediately broadcast a quantum resonance cry into deep space. That signal would act as a homing beacon, summoning every other dormant refugee seed scattered across the galaxy. They would converge on our sector, an unstoppable wave of hungry, living architecture desperate to build an empire of bone and memory right over our ashes. Kale slumped heavily against a calcified pillar. He mumbled frantically about the initial invasion alarms, questioning how the highly advanced academy could have misread a growing building as an armada of hostile ships. Archivist 9 processed the query, its internal gears whirring loudly. The drone explained the largest systemic misunderstanding of the entire crisis. There was never an external boarding party. The defense sensors had not been hacked, spoofed, or blinded. As the Elir seed expanded, it rapidly shifted its localized mass between dimensional planes to spontaneously generate the immense silicate structures. This violent, rhythmic fluctuation in gravity and mass was mathematically identical to the spatial distortion created by a massive fleet of heavy cruisers dropping out of faster-than-light travel. The Academy had locked us inside because it felt the immense, crushing weight of the enemy. It just did not realize the enemy was growing directly upward from its own basement. The invasion force was the very floor beneath our feet. We pushed forward, leaving the central atrium behind and entering the long transit corridor leading directly toward the primary engineering sector. The deeper we went into the infected zone, the more the environment actively reacted to our presence. Or rather, it reacted specifically to Aveline. I walked directly behind the human, my eyes fixed on the bound paper notebook, tucked securely into her utility belt. The ancient processed wood pulp was actually radiating a faint, residual heat. The bioluminescent veins in the surrounding walls pulsed faster and brighter whenever she drew near them. The crystalline tendrils dangling from the high ceiling seemed to lean aggressively toward her, brushing lightly against her shoulders like curious, blind serpents tasting the air. I touched her arm, warning her that the architectural structure was tracking her biosignature specifically. Aveline pulled the notebook from her belt, staring intently at the chaotic diagrams her mother had drawn so many years ago. She traced the worn leather binding with a soot-stained thumb. The architecture around us let out a low, thrumming hum, vibrating in perfect harmony with the cadence of her breathing. It was not a hostile reaction. It was an acknowledgement. She stopped walking completely. The blue light from her dormant plasma cutter reflected in her dark, wide eyes. The scattered pieces of the puzzle, separated by over a decade and thousands of light years, suddenly slammed together in her mind with devastating, heart-stopping clarity. Her mother had been the very first human to ever map the linguistic structure of the Alir. She had understood their complex syntax of pressure, tension, and space. When the excavation site on the Perseus Rim had suffered its minor awakening event 12 years prior, the official academic report claimed Aline Rook's environmental suit had suffered a catastrophic failure, leaving no biological trace of her remains. Aveline looked at me, her voice trembling for the absolute first time since the sirens began howling hours ago. She whispered that the seed absorbed neurological patterns to build its foundational consciousness. It needed architects. It needed minds that understood its fundamental purpose to guide its growth. She gripped the fragile notebook so tightly, her knuckles turned entirely white under the dirt. She realized in that agonizing moment that her mother had not died in a tragic suit malfunction. Aline Rook had never gone missing in the traditional sense. When the ancient refugee ark had briefly stirred from its slumber all those years ago, it had sensed a brilliant mind that could finally speak its native, structural tongue. It had reached out, dissolved her physical form entirely, and pulled her consciousness directly into the embryonic matrix for safekeeping. The monstrous city that was currently tearing our academy apart from the inside out was not just a mindless, alien parasite. Its core foundation, the very intelligence guiding its violent, terrifying expansion, was built upon the absorbed, digitized soul of Aveline's own mother. We were not merely walking into the heart of a doomsday weapon. We were walking right into a tragic family reunion. The heavy, oxidized brass door of the abandoned stellar cartography dome groaned shut, severing the blinding cyan light of the assimilated concourse. We stood in absolute, profound silence. The localized invasion sirens did not penetrate these thick, lead-lined walls. This was a forgotten relic from the Academy's earliest days, built entirely around mechanical gears, polished optical lenses, and vast parchment star charts. There were no quantum data streams here, no wireless holonet connections, and no digital mainframes. Because there was no localized data to consume, the creeping biosilicate vines had abruptly stopped their advance right at the doorframe. We had found the only true sanctuary left on the station. We collapsed onto the dusty wooden floorboards. The air smelled of old oil and aged paper, a stark, comforting contrast to the ozone and blood outside. Aveline sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her back resting against the base of a massive, gear-driven telescope. The stoic, terrifying resilience that had carried us through the collapsing architecture seemed to finally fracture. She stared blankly at the bound notebook resting in her lap, the realization of her mother's fate settling over her like a suffocating shroud. I crawled over to her, my own limbs aching with a deep, chemical exhaustion. I gently pulled the notebook from her rigid fingers. I needed to focus on the problem, not the tragedy. I turned the pages, applying my specialized bio-archaeological training to the jagged, chaotic diagrams. Stripped of the panic of the chase, I could finally see the overarching structure of the dead woman's work. I traced a series of repeating, wave-like incisions carved deeply into the paper. It was an incomplete sequence, ending abruptly near the back cover. I felt the rhythm of the lines, translating the physical pressure of the ink into acoustic concepts. "This is a surgical procedure," I whispered into the quiet dome. "Your mother was not just documenting the awakening cycle. She was designing a countermeasure." She called it a gentle severance. Kale looked up from the rusted utility drone, wiping soot from his forehead. He asked what that meant. I explained that the standard galactic protocol for dealing with an alien parasite was brute force eradication. But the Illyr seed was woven completely into the neural pathways of its victims. If you killed the host structure, you instantly killed every mind trapped inside. The gentle severance was different. It was a theoretical command sequence designed to convince the central seed to voluntarily detach its biometallic taproots from the primary power source and release the absorbed consciousnesses without destroying them. "A command sequence requires a transmitter," Aveline said, her voice hollow. "All digital transmitters on this station are compromised." "We do not need a digital transmitter," I replied, looking up at the towering brass structure of the analog star projector dominating the center of the room. The Illyr language is based on localized phase vibrations and light refraction. We have the acoustic formulas right here on paper, and we have a mechanical light source. Aveline understood instantly. The lethargy vanished from her posture. She surged to her feet, grabbing a set of heavy iron wrenches from a nearby toolkit. Working with Kale, she manually forced the rusted gears of the ancient projector to turn, aligning its primary focal crystal with the exact center of the room. Alara channeled her bioluminescence through the projector's base, providing a steady, organic light source, while Aveline carefully adjusted the refractive lenses according to the geometric angles I read aloud from the notebook. As the final lens clicked into place, the projector flared. It did not display a map of the stars. Instead, the concentrated light bent and distorted the ambient bioelectric field in the room, capturing the lingering, anomalous resonance bleeding off the notebook's pages. A figure materialized in the dusty air. It was not a stable hologram. It was a flickering, three-dimensional shadow made of fractured light and shifting static. But the silhouette was unmistakably human. She wore an old model environmental suit, her face obscured by the digital distortion, yet her posture radiated a calm, commanding presence. Aveline dropped the heavy iron wrench. The heavy metal clattered against the wooden floorboards. She took a slow, trembling step toward the projection. "Mom?" she breathed, the word cracking in her throat. The projection shifted. The cognitive echo of Aline Rook turned her head. Her voice did not come from the air. It vibrated directly within our jawbones, a translation of pure intention. She told her daughter she had grown so tall. The voice carried immense sorrow, recognizing the harsh, violent reality Aveline had been forced to navigate alone. Aveline fell to her knees, reaching out, but her hand passed right through the cold, shifting light. She demanded to know why her mother had left, why she had allowed herself to be absorbed into a machine. Aline's echo pulsed softly, dimming and brightening with the rhythm of a failing heartbeat. She explained that she had no choice. The seed on the Perseus rim had been terrified, waking up alone in a dead sector, and it had reached out for the nearest mind capable of understanding its architecture. She had anchored it, keeping it dormant to protect the galaxy. But her consciousness was slowly eroding under the weight of an entire city's memory. Then, Aline revealed the devastating truth about the ancient civilization. The Illyr Choir had never built weapons of mass destruction. They were a society of artists, architects, and philosophers facing a cosmic extinction event. They built the seeds as refugee arcs, launching their digitized civilization into the void, hoping to find fertile ground to rebuild. But the universe is a dark and paranoid place. Every single time a seed landed on an inhabited world and began to unpack its structures, the native civilizations reacted with absolute, immediate violence. They fired plasma cannons, dropped nuclear payloads, and initiated orbital bombardments. Over tens of thousands of years, the seeds learned a tragic, localized lesson. They learned that organic life always brings fire. They learned that the only way to survive a waking cycle was to violently, aggressively assimilate the local population before the locals could draw their weapons. The seed tearing Meridian Crown apart was not an invader. It was a traumatized, terrified child lashing out in the dark, misinterpreting the station's panic as a declaration of war. "You cannot fight it," Aveline's voice echoed in our bones. "If you attack the core, it will accelerate its growth to defend itself. You must offer it a protection pattern. You must walk into the center of the reactor and sing a structural lullaby. You must show it that it is safe to sleep." The projection began to violently degrade, the light fracturing into loose, glowing threads. Aveline's time was running out. She looked at me, the quiet alien scholar sitting in the dust. She stated that Aveline possessed the physical strength to breach the core, but a human mind was too loud, too inherently wired for conflict and survival, to broadcast the necessary calm. A human could not speak the language of peace to a terrified machine. I was the only one who could. As a scholar of extinct syntax, my mind could translate the emotional concept of safety into the physical, architectural rhythm the Ilir seed would understand. I had to become the bridge. The weight of the galaxy suddenly rested squarely on my unassuming shoulders. My entire life had been dedicated to staying invisible, to avoiding danger. Now, I had to be the loudest voice in the room. The projection flickered one final time. Aveline looked back at her daughter. "The gentle severance will save the station," Aveline warned, her voice fading into a whisper of static. "But detaching the seed will erase the central neural anchor. It will erase me, Aveline. I cannot survive the disconnection." Aveline lowered her head. The stoic mask shattered completely, replaced by the raw, unadulterated grief of a child losing her parent for the second time. She confessed, her tears hitting the dusty floorboards, that she had never cared about the prestigious degree or the galactic politics. She had spent 12 years turning herself into a hardened survivalist just to find the truth about her family. She had finally found her mother, only to realize that saving 50,000 innocent lives meant she had to be the one to pull the plug. She had to choose between the ghost of her past and the living, breathing reality of the present. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Kale looked away. Alara dimmed her light in respectful mourning. Even the rusted drone remained perfectly still. Aveline slowly wiped her face with the back of her bruised, bloodied hand. She looked up at the fading projection of the woman who had sacrificed everything to hold back the dark. "I am a Deathworlder," Aveline said, her voice dropping to a steady, unbreakable whisper. "We do not leave people buried in the rubble, even if it breaks our own hearts." Aveline Rook smiled, a beautiful, tragic expression of absolute pride. And then, the light projection shattered entirely, plunging the room back into the dim, mechanical shadows. Aveline stood up. She picked up the heavy plasma cutter, her face set in lines of cold, determined stone. She looked at me, holding out her hand to pull me up from the floor. We had a lullaby to sing, and a city to put to sleep. Before stepping out of the stellar cartography dome, Aveline made a tactical decision that defied all standard survival logic. She rigged the mechanical gears of the heavy brass doors to remain unlocked from the outside, and ordered Archivist 9 to broadcast a localized, low-frequency acoustic chirp through the ventilation shafts. It was a beacon. Within 20 minutes, the terrified, exhausted remnants of the student body began to pour into the analog sanctuary. Hundreds of students, faculty members, and maintenance staff, battered and weeping, crammed into the lead-lined room. By turning the forgotten observatory into a mass shelter, we proved to the cold calculus of the galaxy that Meridian Crown was not entirely lost. There was still a pulse worth saving, but the galaxy was running out of patience. The rusted utility drone's optical sensor flared a harsh, blinking crimson. Archivist 9 relayed a direct, unencrypted ultimatum from Commander Sail Ith of the Vanguard Quarantine Fleet. The message was brutally short. The fleet had achieved optimal firing formation. If the localized mass fluctuations did not cease completely within 15 minutes, they would initiate global thermal pacification. Professor Orlex Vaughn, missing 2 of his 4 arms and bleeding a pale, sluggish fluid, pushed himself away from the barricades. The disgraced academic looked at the terrified faces of the hundreds of students huddled in the dust. He turned to the utility drone and demanded a direct audio uplink to the interstellar communication grid. He did not ask for rescue. He broadcast a full, unredacted confession. He detailed the executive board's illegal acquisition of the Alir embryo, the deliberate bypassing of galactic safety protocols, and the horrific reality of the assimilation process. He transmitted the security logs and the biological data directly to every news outlet and council node within 50 light-years. By exposing the corporate treason, Orlex completely annihilated his own prestige, his career, and his freedom. But the sheer political shockwave of his confession forced the Vanguard commander to halt the firing sequence. The fleet demanded verification, buying us an additional 10 minutes of agonizing, borrowed time. We left the safety of the dome, a vastly smaller strike team now consisting only of Aveline, Alara, the rusted drone, and myself. Kale stayed behind to manage the heavy brass doors and protect the survivors. Our path downward ended abruptly at the entrance to the primary anti-gravity concourse. This massive, cylindrical chamber was originally designed to facilitate frictionless transit between the upper and lower halves of the Academy. Now, it was a fractured nightmare of chaotic physics. The gravity plating had been thoroughly corrupted by the expanding seed. With every rhythmic, booming heartbeat of the living architecture, the gravitational orientation of the room violently inverted. The ceiling became the floor, and the floor became the ceiling. Below us, or above us depending on the second, yawned the open, blindingly bright exhaust vent of the station's main fusion reactor. The Alir roots had already torn away the protective bulkheads, exposing a raging ocean of contained stellar fire. A single misstep into that void meant instant, vaporizing death. The only way across the vast, flipping chamber was a tangled web of heavy maintenance cables and structural scaffolding that spanned the dizzying drop. But the cables were no longer standard alloy. They were rapidly calcifying, turning into slick, glowing biological tendons. Aveline did not hesitate. She slung her heavy plasma cutter over her back and leapt onto the nearest tendon just as the gravity violently shifted. I screamed as my stomach lurched, my boots lifting off the deck. Aveline grabbed my wrist in midair, her grip like a mechanical vice, and hauled me onto the shifting web. Alara followed, her bioluminescence flaring brightly against the blinding glare of the reactor below. We crawled. It was a grueling, agonizing test of spatial awareness and structural intuition. Brute force was completely useless here. Aveline moved with the terrifying grace of a predator raised in shifting, collapsing tunnels. She did not fight the inverted gravity. She anticipated it. She pressed her hands against the glowing tendons, feeling the microscopic stress fractures and the internal fluid pressure of the alien tissue. She barked sharp, precise orders, telling us exactly where to place our feet, which vines could hold our weight, and which ones would snap under the kinetic strain. But the seed realized we were approaching its heart. It could not tear the web apart without damaging its own taproots, so it deployed a vastly more insidious defense mechanism. It weaponized our own psychology. As I reached for a thick, pulsating vine, The blinding light of the reactor shifted. The empty air beside me shimmered, and a figure materialized on the precarious web. It was my older brother. He looked exactly as he had the day I left my homeworld, his face lined with gentle concern. He reached his hand out toward me, urging me to step off the dangerous cable and walk toward a sturdy, safe platform that had suddenly appeared just out of reach. He told me the trial was over, the danger had passed, and it was time to rest. For a fraction of a second, the overwhelming urge to let go, to surrender to the comforting illusion, nearly broke my grip. Then, my academic training kicked in. I listened to his voice, not the tone, but the structure. My brother belonged to a species that communicated heavily through subtle tectonic shifts and low-frequency hums. The apparition speaking to me was using perfect, unblemished galactic common syntax, completely lacking the halting, rhythmic pauses native to our linguistic biology. The emotional cadence was completely wrong. "It is a lie!" I shouted, squeezing my eyes shut and gripping the biological cable tighter. "Do not listen to them. The syntax is flawless, but the context is dead. It is translating our desire for safety into a physical trap." Aveline encountered her own ghosts, phantoms of her harsh childhood, instructors from the academy, and even the mimicking voices of security personnel materialized around her, begging her to turn back, promising a sudden, miraculous evacuation. But Aveline merely tightened her jaw, closed her eyes, and navigated purely by the physical tension of the cables beneath her scarred hands. We moved through a choir of comforting lies, guided only by the brutal, undeniable truth of gravity and friction. We finally reached the opposite side of the chasm, collapsing onto the solid, unmoving deck of the reactor core antechamber. Alara was hyperventilating, her glow a terrified dim pulse, while the utility drone rolled heavily off Aveline's back, its treads sparking. Directly in front of us stood the massive, circular portal leading into the epicenter of the assimilation. The door was a horrifying amalgamation of original tritanium plating and thick, interwoven ribs of glowing silicate bone. It pulsed with a rapid, terrified rhythm. Sensing our proximity, Archivist 9 rolled forward. The drone extended a small, sparking data spike from its chassis and plunged it directly into a small, uncorrupted patch of the original terminal interface. The ancient gears inside the little robot screamed in protest as the artificial intelligence fought a brutal, microsecond war against the biological mainframe to force the locking mechanism. With a deafening, wet tear of parting tissue and grinding metal, the massive core doors slowly began to slide open. A blast of warm, fragrant air washed over us, completely devoid of the ozone and blood that plagued the upper levels. It smelled like ancient forests and electrified rain. Archivist 9 retracted its data spike, its optical lens flickering weakly. The voice of the station echoed from the rusted speaker one last time. It warned us that the environment beyond the threshold was no longer bound by the standard laws of physics or linear perception. The core was a swirling vortex of raw memory and pure intention. The machine stated plainly that stepping into the epicenter required a complete synchronization with the alien network. It warned us that whoever walked through those doors and linked their mind to the city might save the station, but they would absolutely not return as the same person they were when they entered. Aveline stood up, her silhouette framed by the blinding, ethereal light spilling from the open core. She looked at me, her dark eyes reflecting the chaotic beauty of the ancient machine. We had run out of time, we had run out of space, and now we had to walk directly into the mind of a god. We stepped over the threshold, and the universe abruptly expanded, leaving the rigid, claustrophobic geometry of the Orbital Academy entirely behind. The reactor core antechamber had given way to an impossible geography. It was a staggering, infinite library of living light. The heavy tritanium shielding that once contained the fusion reactor had been spun into thousands of towering, organic balconies, spiraling downward into a glowing abyss. I recognized the familiar shapes of our daily academic lives, but they were utterly transformed. The heavy lecture hall desks, the polished safety railings, the magnetic whiteboards, and the quantum charging racks had all blossomed into pale, breathing silicate. They were overgrown with luminescent, neural moss, forming a breathtaking cathedral of biomechanical memory. The air inside the core was not silent. It hummed with a million overlapping whispers, each one a thread of possibility. As we walked across the translucent floor, the environment reacted to our footfalls by manifesting fleeting, translucent ghosts. I saw the shimmering silhouette of a botanical student laughing, the glowing outline of a professor furiously sketching an equation, and the quiet, terrified prayer of a young cadet. The alien seed was actively absorbing the collective consciousness of the academy, treating our fleeting thoughts as raw building materials. Listening to those overlapping whispers, a profound and tragic realization washed over me. The invasion sirens that had triggered this entire nightmare were never a system malfunction, nor were they a deliberate lie by the station's intelligence. The seed was an empathic mirror. Waking up in the dark, it had felt the overwhelming, blinding panic of 50,000 trapped students and faculty members. Lacking a voice of its own, it had simply translated that ambient, localized terror into the only language the station's defense grid understood: a maximum-level military threat. The deafening alarms were just the seed echoing our own fear back at us. At the exact center of this impossible, swirling library, hovering directly above the open, churning maw of the dormant fusion reactor, was the central neural anchor. It took the form of a colossal weeping willow, its trunk and cascading branches woven entirely from spun glass and pulsing nervous tissue. Standing beneath the glowing canopy of the great tree was Aveline Rook. She was no longer the fractured, static-laced projection we had spoken to in the analog observatory. Here, in the heart of the machine she commanded, she was solid. She was rendered in heartbreakingly perfect detail, right down to the grease stains on her surveyor jacket and the exhausted lines around her eyes. But her visual integrity was a fading illusion. Her edges were slowly dissolving into streams of data ash, drifting upward into the canopy. Her individual ego, the singular human soul that had held the seed in a state of arrested development for over a decade, was finally running dry. Aveline stopped walking. She stared at the woman she had spent her entire youth trying to find. She did not run forward. She stood perfectly still, her shoulders trembling under the weight of an impossible reunion. Aveline turned toward her daughter. Her voice did not echo in the vast chamber. It resonated directly within the silicate floor beneath our boots. She told Aveline that the seed had not drawn her across the galaxy because she was a dangerous Deathworlder capable of tearing metal apart. The alien architecture cared nothing for violence or combat. Aveline pointed toward the massive, pulsing roots of the glass tree. She explained that Aveline was chosen because her body possessed a profound, instinctual capability to feel the physical rhythm of endurance. Growing up on a harsh salvage colony, Aveline had learned to read the stress fractures in a collapsing mineshaft, to feel the exact breaking point of a load-bearing beam, and to understand the kinetic tension of failing architecture. That instinctual, physical empathy was the rarest trait in the galaxy. It was the structural rhythm that perfectly matched the Illyr syntax. The seed did not need a warrior. It needed an architect who understood how to hold a collapsing roof steady. But the price for providing that stability was absolute. Aveline extended a glowing, dissolving hand toward the center of the tree. She warned her daughter that completing the synchronization sequence required a permanent anchor. If Aveline pushed her own structural rhythm into the core to calm the seed, the immense current of the city's nervous system would pull her in completely. She would take her mother's place. She would become the new ghost in the machine, trapped forever in a state of suspended animation to keep the station from blooming. Aveline looked down at her scarred, bloodied hands. She took a slow, deep breath, her face hardening into a mask of pure, sacrificial resolve. She stepped forward to take the burden. "No," I said, my voice cutting sharply through the whispers of the living library. Aveline stopped, looking back at me with a mixture of shock and desperate anger. I stepped past her, my bio-archaeological training overriding my natural cowardice. I looked directly at the glowing avatar of Elaine Rook. I explained that the fundamental flaw in their plan was isolation. One human mind, no matter how resilient, was a solitary pillar trying to carry the weight of an entire sky. It was too intense, too focused, and ultimately, it would snap just as Aveline was snapping now. The Ilir architecture thrived on complex, interwoven support networks. We could not let one person bear the entirety of the protection pattern. We needed to create a vaulted ceiling. We needed a chorus. I turned to the rusted utility drone, Archivist 9, which was idling near the entrance. I ordered the artificial intelligence to open a two-way, unencrypted acoustic channel directly to the analog cartography dome, where Kale was guarding the survivors. We would use the localized audio feed. I would take the terrified, exhausted, but living sounds of the hundreds of students, their synchronized breathing, their whispered prayers, the steady beating of their diverse hearts, and run it through my own mind. As a scholar of extinct syntax, I could translate that multi-species harmony into the structural language of peace, distributing the psychological load across hundreds of cognitive layers. Aveline would provide the physical anchor, but the survivors would provide the emotional weight. Before Aveline could process the sheer audacity of the theory, the Grand Cathedral violently shuddered. The Vanguard fleet's deadline was evaporating. Below us, the sea of contained stellar fire roared as the reactor's containment field began to permanently fail. Driven by a sudden, desperate survival instinct, a dozen massive, pulsating energy roots abruptly detached from the canopy of the glass willow. They plunged straight downward, diving for the raw fusion plasma. If those roots drank the starfire, Meridian Crown would violently, uncontrollably bloom. It would tear the orbital rings apart, expanding into a massive refugee city in the vacuum of space, killing everyone aboard and forcing the quarantine fleet to burn the entire sector to ash. "We are out of time!" Aveline roared, the diplomatic stillness completely vanishing. She dropped to her knees on the translucent floor directly beneath the central canopy. She reached into her utility belt and drew out the heavy, jagged slab of the alloy desk she had torn in half at the very beginning of the nightmare. It was no longer a piece of academic furniture. It was a pure, physical manifestation of kinetic force, her resonance key. I fell to my knees beside her. I pulled the worn paper notebook from my pack, frantically tearing out the pages covered in Aveline's chaotic diagrams, spreading them in a precise, geometric circle around us. The dead wood pulp formed a grounding ring, shielding our immediate space from the digital corruption. Finally, from my deepest pocket, I retrieved a heavy, antique mechanical metronome I had salvaged from the observatory. I wound the heavy brass spring as tightly as my trembling fingers would allow, and released the pendulum. Tick, tick, tick. A steady, physical heartbeat cut through the ethereal whispers of the alien god. Aveline gripped the jagged metal shard with both hands, raising it above her head, her muscles locking as she prepared to drive her own unyielding rhythm directly into the nervous system of the ancient city. I closed my eyes, reaching out with my mind to catch the acoustic feed from the survivors, preparing to translate the hope of 50,000 souls. We knelt in the epicenter of the collapse, surrounded by paper, rusted gears, and broken metal, ready to sing a sleeping giant back to bed. The rusted utility drone emitted a frantic, high-pitched screech that shattered the ethereal whispers of the core. Archivist 9 did not need to translate the warning. Through the massive, gaping breach in the station's hull, far above us, I saw the distant starfield warp and bleed into a blinding, apocalyptic white. The Vanguard quarantine fleet had finished its countdown. They were actively cycling their thermal pacification cannons. The localized gravity inside the reactor chamber violently buckled, a physical shockwave of impending annihilation that drove me to my knees. The Ilir seed felt the incoming fire. It panicked. The massive, glowing roots suspended over the fusion reactor surged downward in a desperate, frenzied plunge, aiming to drink the stellar plasma and detonate the station before the fleet could strike. We had mere seconds before the roots made contact. Directly between us and the plummeting roots, the central control podium erupted from the silicate floor. It was a massive, fused block of original Academy alloy and dense, biological bone, designed by the seed's defensive instincts to shield its primary nerve cluster. The mechanical locks of the station had been entirely overwritten by the alien architecture. A wave of concentrated gravity blasted outward from the podium with every rhythmic pulse of the core, rendering the area completely impenetrable to standard machinery. The industrial plasma cutter Aveline carried sparked, short-circuited by the intense gravitational distortion, and died instantly. We were locked out of the epicenter. The gentle severance could not be initiated without physical access to the resonant spine hidden inside that impenetrable block. Aveline dropped the useless cutter. She did not look at the blinding sky, nor did she look at the raging fusion fire below. She sprinted directly into the center of the gravity storms. The sheer kinetic pressure pushing against her should have crushed her ribs, but the human simply lowered her shoulders and drove her boots into the translucent deck. She reached the fused podium. It was the exact size and shape of the standard lecture desk we had shared just hours ago, twisted now into a monument of alien defense. Aveline slammed her bare hands onto the heavy edges of the biomechanical block. I watched, breathless, as she planted her feet, the muscles in her back cording with absolute, terrifying tension. This was not a panicked thrashing. This was the exact same motion, the exact same calculated distribution of kinetic force she had used in the classroom, but scaled to an impossible magnitude. She let out a roar that tore from the very bottom of her lungs, a sound of pure Deathworlder defiance, and pulled violently upward. The sound of the fused podium cracking was deafening. It was a wet metallic shriek that echoed louder than the sirens. The heavy alloy and dense bone shattered under her grip, ripping entirely in half. She cast the heavy debris aside, exposing the glowing, vibrating resonance spine of the city's nervous system. She had broken the unbreakable lock with nothing but her own flesh and bone. She jammed the jagged piece of her original desk against the exposed nerve, creating the physical bridge. "Now, Neris!" she screamed over the roaring plasma. I stood within my protective circle of scattered paper, the mechanical metronome ticking steadily at my feet. Through the rusted drone's open communication channel, the audio feed from the analog sanctuary flooded my mind. I heard the terrified, ragged breathing of Kale, the soft, glowing hum of Alara, the rapid, shallow gasps of the avian cadets, and the deep, rumbling heartbeats of the heavy Krell students. Hundreds of different species, hundreds of different neurological patterns, all united by a single, overwhelming desire to see tomorrow. I closed my eyes and gathered those sounds. Using my training in extinct linguistics, I did not translate their fear. I translated their presence. I wove their diverse, chaotic rhythms into a single, cohesive acoustic pattern and projected it straight into the core. It was a message of absolute, unconditional sanctuary. We told the terrified ancient machine that we were not raising weapons. We were not bringing fire. We were offering it a quiet room, a steady foundation, and a place to rest its weary mind. It was a diplomatic chorus no galactic civilization had ever thought to try. At the exposed resonance spine, the glowing, fragmented avatar of Aveline Rook materialized one final time. She placed her translucent hands over her daughter's bleeding, trembling knuckles. Together, they pressed down on the makeshift key, physically forcing the gentle severance command into the rushing current of the seed's nervous system. Aveline looked at Aveline, A profound peace finally settling over her exhausted features. She did not speak, but the intention washed over the entire chamber. She was letting go. Instead of clinging to a tortured, half-alive existence trapped within a data matrix, she accepted the finality of the severance. As the command took hold, the projection of Aveline Rook dissolved entirely, her digital ghost scattering into a million particles of silent light that faded into the dark. The backlash of the severance was immediate and violent. The seed shrieked, a psychic shockwave that threatened to rip Aveline's consciousness right out of her skull to replace the anchor it had just lost. The human gasped, her eyes rolling back as the massive gravitational pull of the city's mind dragged her forward. But she did not fall. My translation hit the core like a tidal wave. The burden of the anchor was abruptly dispersed. Instead of trying to swallow one solitary human mind, the seed met the harmonized chorus of hundreds of survivors. The immense psychological weight was fractured and shared across our entire linked network. We all felt a sudden, heavy pressure in our chests, a moment of profound, shared exhaustion. But it was bearable. We carried the weight together, shielding the Deathworlder from being consumed. The colossal roots hovering inches above the fusion plasma froze. The violent, rhythmic heartbeat of the living architecture slowed, softening into a gentle, rhythmic hum. The towering silicate trees, the glowing balconies, and the neural moss began to rapidly retract. The city was folding in on itself, pulling away from the reactor and the structural supports of the Academy. The blinding cyan light dimmed as the massive entity condensed, shrinking down until it was nothing more than a smooth, dormant sphere of pale bone, resting quietly in the center of the reactor deck. The alarms abruptly ceased. The station's emergency lighting flickered, and the standard, warm yellow illumination flooded the chamber. Archivist 9's optical lens flashed a steady green. The drone reported that Commander Sile Ith had detected the sudden cessation of the localized mass fluctuations. With the threat neutralized and the civilian presence confirmed, the Vanguard fleet had powered down their thermal cannons at the very last possible second. The purge order was officially canceled. The nightmare was over. The aftermath was a swift, brutal reckoning for the architects of our misery. Professor Orlix Von's broadcast had shattered the veil of secrecy. The Galactic Council forces boarded the station just hours later, securing the dormant seed and immediately placing the entire executive board under arrest for catastrophic endangerment and illegal quarantine violation. Orlex was stripped of all academic titles, his legacy entirely ruined, exactly as he had predicted. But the galaxy's perception of what happened in the dark corridors of Meridian Crown shifted in a way nobody expected. Aveline Rook did not face the prejudice reserved for her kind. She became a symbol, but not of the mindless, territorial violence so often attributed to Deathworlders. She represented a vastly more terrifying, awe-inspiring kind of bravery. She was the girl who dared to shove her bare hands into the gears of an impossible, world-ending machine and force it to yield. She proved that the strength of Earth was not just in surviving a hostile environment, but in dragging hope out of the fire. As I sit in the quiet, restored library weeks later, watching Aveline write carefully in a brand new paper notebook, my entire understanding of the universe has fundamentally changed. The Galactic Council fears humans because they are resilient, because they are strong, and because they come from a world that tried to kill them every single day. But that is not what makes them truly unsettling. What makes humanity the most formidable force in the galaxy is that when the walls are collapsing, when the sirens are screaming, and when every logical instinct demands retreat, they will still step directly into the ruins. They will walk into the dark with a trembling heart, and by sheer, stubborn force of will, they will pull everyone else back into the light with them. Thank you so much for listening to this story, and please let me know in the comments where you are listening from, so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-Fi Stories channel, like the video, and support by pressing the hype button, so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.